ahead and get started. Good morning, students, faculty, and staff. My name is Claudia Catota, and I'm the Chief Diversity Officer and Special Assistant to the President here at CSUB. Black Lives, thank you for joining us for today's conversation. Today's topic will be intersectionality, Black Lives Matter, Filipino, Latinx, and LGBTQ+. These conversations will be recorded and posted on our Equity, Inclusion, and Compliance website. I would first like to thank ASI for this partnership on the Community Conversation series as we continue to explore topics on social and racial justice. I would like to then now invite Maria Espinosa, ASI Vice President of University Affairs, to provide a welcome. Maria.
It's okay. Hello, Runner family, and welcome to another segment of Community Conversations. My name is Maria Espinosa, and I am the Vice President of University Affairs for ASI. As you may know, ASI, along with other departments on campus, have been actively engaging in important conversations that pertain to the world today. It is my honor to welcome you to this week's conversation, where we will be discussing the importance of intersectionality and honoring Hispanic Heritage Month. This week's topic is especially important to me because I am a first-generation Hispanic student, and I am very proud of that. Me siento muy orgullosa de poder representar a mi comunidad hispana y demostrarle al mundo que juntos todo es posible. I am very proud to be able to represent my Hispanic community and demonstrate to the world that together anything is possible. I think it is important to have conversations like today because it shows the world how even though we may come from different backgrounds, we can work together to create a better tomorrow. To quote the first Hispanic woman on the Supreme Court, Sonia Sotomayor, as you discover what strengths you can draw from your community in this world from which it stands apart, look outward as well as inward, build bridges instead of walls. And to that I say, let's draw strength from this community conversation and begin to build the bridges that will lead us to a better tomorrow. Thank you.
Thank you, Maria, and thank you, ASI. As a reminder, if you have questions for our panelists, please type your questions in the Q&A section and we will present them to the panelists. I would like to welcome today's panel of experts, each who brings a rich diversity of experience and perspectives on the topic of intersectionality. We have Dr. Arno Argueta. Dr. Argueta has a PhD in Iberian and Latin American literatures and cultures by the University of Texas at Austin and is currently assistant professor of Latin American cinema, literature and culture in the Department of Modern Languages and Literatures here at CSUB. Dr. Argueta specializes in contemporary film from Central America, Brazil, and Mexico. We next have Dr. Tracy Salisbury, assistant professor for interdisciplinary studies at CSUB. Dr. Salisbury has a PhD in kinesiology from the University of North Carolina, Greensboro. She also teaches both in the kinesiology and interdisciplinary studies here at CSUB. And most currently, Dr. Salisbury is working on a very important endeavor, which is to establish ethnic studies at CSUB and leading efforts to develop Black studies and Indigenous studies. Next, we have Dr. Richard Zamora, who is an assistant professor of psychology at CSUB. Dr. Zamora has a PhD in counseling psychology with a graduate minor in psychology from New Mexico State University. Dr. Zamora has completed a predoctoral clinical internship focused on general clinical and LGBTQ+ population at the University of California, Davis, as well as postdoctoral psychology residency, general clinical and career counseling, also at University of California, Davis. Dr. Zamora's research includes multicultural psychology, counseling psychology, romantic relationships, LGBTQ+ psychology, quantitative and qualitative research, and mental health. Please join me in welcoming Drs. Argueta, Salisbury, and Zamora.
So we're here to talk about intersectionality.
Oh, well, you're reaching for some help here, Rich.
So I think we can start by defining what intersectionality is, right?
That means you go first, Arno.
All right. Well, intersectionality, it's a critical perspective. It's a concept voiced by Dr. Kimberly Crenshaw, right? And it's basically, we can say that it poses that when that a person is not defined by a single identity, but how all of these identities crisscross and add to a person's perspective in their world, right? If I'm remembering correctly, there are Dr. Crenshaw points to three modes of intersectionality, right? So representative, which is probably the one that we see the most and the one that I work with the most, but there's also structural, and if I'm not wrong, the last form is symbolic intersectionality, right? And so I work most with representative intersectionality because of my work, which is mostly on media. So I think it's something that we can see every day, right? Something that we can see. It's always being called out in Hollywood, for example, in the field that I work with, with the representation of Latinos in Hollywood, Latinos being the largest minority group in the United States, and especially around Hollywood, right? Working in Hollywood films, there is still very little representation of that community in cinema, right?
I'm sorry, Rich. I would take that definition a little bit further with Dr. Kimberly Crenshaw's definitions, and being that she was also one of the founders of critical race theory, is that she was trying to give something a name that didn't have a name. Right now, unfortunately, intersectionality is being overused and misused. Kimberly Crenshaw was trying to talk about people who are unseen and unrepresented and unprotected. She was not talking about the entire world in terms of intersectionality, and now the term is being used that way. She was speaking of how I would represent myself as a Black woman, a queer woman, a Black feminist queer woman, to make sure that I am seen, that I am represented primarily legally and in terms of political representation. And as Dr. Argueta said, representation, I would say, is probably one of the most key functions she was speaking to. So we need to remember that at this point, we have a habit in society of running with theories and ideas that have a specific purpose.
Mm-hmm. And speaking with the representation, I also see intersectionality as a place to understand, and a lens to look at those who have been invisible in our community. So there's the visibility aspect of being able to understand how these social identities overlaps with each other, how they intersect, and how these experiences can be understood from understanding the intersectionality of the different invisible identities that people hold, and bringing it to our attention and being able to understand how they overlap, how they interact, and to get a further, deeper understanding of people's experiences, and looking at these various categories and identities that people bring in to different spaces.
Yeah, I'd like to kind of also hem on the idea that Dr. Salisbury brought up about the simplification of the term, right? The misuse of the term. I think there's a good number of people that see intersectionality as a type of victimization, but it has nothing to do with that, right? It's not about saying, "Hey, I suffer more than you." It's really not about suffering Olympics of sorts. It's about precisely calling attention to the fact that by saying, for example, I identify myself as Latinx, it doesn't mean that all Latinx people are the same, right? So just kind of wanted to hem a little bit on that idea. And we had a set of questions, right? Sort of to guide the conversation a little bit. One that I'd like to talk about is how does your academic discipline and research talk about intersectionality? How does it come into play? How does it inform it?
Well, I guess for me, My take is that it's always to change the academic lens. Enough has been taught from a majority perspective. I believe virtually anything can be taught from a different perspective, and it needs to. I'm a practitioner of Bell Hooks's idea of moving things from the margins to the center, and that changes the conversation. If we're talking about feminism, it's a much more powerful conversation to me at this point in time in history to talk about it from a Latinx or a Black feminist perspective. It's a much richer, deeper conversation because we're putting unheard voices in the middle of the conversation and forcing people to grapple with new ideas. And that's what forms my research is trying to let people know that the ideas are here. Also, it's also a reflection of African-American life in society. African-Americans have consistently, Black Americans, I will say, not just African-Americans, but Black Americans have consistently been the canary in the coal mine in terms of issues of race and intersectionality. And others benefit from our hard work and our suffering, and that needs to be repeatedly remembered and acknowledged. And, particularly in the sense of intersectionality, I'll be clear, Dr. Kimberly Crenshaw created that particularly for a Black feminist lens. There's no ways about it. This is in the academic tradition of Black female academics. If you're not familiar with Audre Lorde as a student, you should be. Audre Lorde was the poster child for Kimberly Crenshaw's ideal of intersectionality. She was a Black queer woman. She was disabled. She also was suffering from cancer and had tremendous battles. She is a hero of mine. Her work is everlasting. And I would tell you to, if you have not read it, I would tell you to read, and I could make some suggestions later on.
Yes. Thank you for that, Dr. Salisbury. For me, in training future therapists in the field of mental health, we do have to, I teach students to understand the different identities and intersectionality of race, gender, and class and sex in terms of understanding what the person's experiences are and how we can look at the lived experience of people who struggle with mental health issues from an intersectionality lens. Mm-hmm. And what that really means is validating their experiences that have contributed to what they're bringing into therapy and what they're struggling with. And how can we also help the individual, but impact it in a systematic level by understanding the different intersection of what they're bringing into therapy and just really looking at it in multiple aspects. And that it helps us explain the different experiences that the person comes in therapy.
Yes. So thank you for that. I also already mentioned a little bit about what I do, but more than just looking at cinema, I look at specific discourses, right? And one of these discourses is about the disposability of bodies. And my research really could not exist without taking this concept into account, right? Because really, disposable bodies have been not only marked by, in terms of gender, but also in terms of race, in terms of ethnicity, right? And a lot of times because of more than one of these identifiers, right? And so it's also I would say the Latinx experience in the United States cannot be understood without looking at gender, at queerness, at race. In fact, to talk about the Latinx experience, we really are talking about a sort of semi-racialized ethnicity, right? It's not really it's not as simple as saying all Latinos are the same. There are different nations, and also the relationship between the United States as global North and Latin America as global South can also add to that intersectional perspective, right? And so I think that's something that we have to constantly keep in the conversation. And and another point that not often makes it into the conversation because of its representational focus, right? But it's also social status and income, right? It's also very important to talk about when it comes to the intersectional perspective. And so in my work, I really try to talk about these and bring these into the conversation of what we see in film, right?
Mm-hmm.
I kind of want to jump into and expand on something that my colleagues are pointing out. Dr. Argueta said earlier about how people are viewing intersectionality as some kind of victimization Olympics. And the reality is there's nothing further from the truth, because the reality is the passion and the push to have intersectionality is also leading to misunderstandings of progress and power. Because that's also what intersectionality is about. It's about ultimately you can recognize certain things, but if I don't have the power to change my position, then it stays the same. So, for example, as Dr. Zamora was talking about, there's probably never been a more welcome era in terms of people of color to embrace mental health wellness. This has been a taboo thing. There's always been considered that you should have a strength and that you should not pursue mental health. But the problem is with an encouragement and an openness to mental wellness is a discovery that we do not have enough therapists and psychiatrists and counselors of color or trained in queer issues. So this has created a new problem, and this is about structure. And this is why structure needs to change, because we need to invite these voices in. I mean, if you're looking at the city of Bakersfield, there is not one African-American mental health counselor you could go to. There is not one on our campus that you could go to. And so this is a right time to change the structure of that. And Dr. Argueta and I share doing cultural studies in film and television, and representation can be used against you because one hit show, as for example, say the show Pose, gives the false impression that television has diversified and is representing Black queer, Latinx queer, Asia Pacific Islander characters in a broad way, when they are not. It is just one show. And that one show can be problematic. It can have problems. It can make mistakes. It can be a dominant voice because you need multiple visions. And a historical example would be the popularity of The Cosby Show and A Different World, where people had no idea that Black people could have a doctor and a lawyer in the same household, which was a bizarre understanding of Black life, or the concept of A Different World when people had no idea HBCUs existed. One of the most brilliant shows of television that I thought was great for Latinx representation was rebooting the show One Day at a Time and making it about a Latinx family. It was an extremely powerful show. So this is how we represent. And this is how we change the structure. But the problem with intersectionality and understanding intersectionality is understanding it's just identifying a problem, and it's not addressing the power, the inequity of power.
Yeah, in kind of following up on that, right? A lot of the, I would say a lot of the representation of Latinx peoples in television straight out just goes for cisgendered white Latinos, right? And if there's some variation, it's maybe the Afro Latino that's brought in if the show is in New York or if it's in Florida, right? But even in California, the variation of Latino backgrounds and Latino voices is simplified, right? I know there's been a hit TV show on Netflix, right? Hentified. That was actually one of the producers is from Bakersfield, right? And he's actually Mexican and Guatemalan, but the show just simplifies this into a Mexican East LA experience. And so really, yes, it's great to see this experience being represented on television, but just talking about Los Angeles, you're talking about all kinds of Latino experiences, right? Even in the in East Los Angeles that can change so drastically.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm glad that you two are bringing that up. I think, Dr. Salisbury, thank you for talking about the mental health needs and the lack of representation of therapists of color and mental health professionals who, specializes in working with these communities. But also, historically, we do know that people of color, marginalized communities don't typically go to therapy because they don't see people like them that possibly can understand their experiences. Folks who have, the same skin color or same identities that they bring into the room, they have, traditionally speaking, people of color have not accessed mental health services because of the lack of representation in the field. So, now it's really important, especially now, to be able to engage in these conversations and, talk about what are some things we can do to be able to increase the representation and access for people who traditionally will not be able, or are not represented and are not accessing these services.
And I want to keep harping on what Dr. Guetta said about depth, that people of color are not monolithic. And so one of the beautiful things about understanding intersectionality is also understanding that these racialized groups, the structuralized groups we have created, are trying to work out issues, ideas, and philosophies within their own community. So, for example, we had a beautiful introduction from Maria, who identified herself as Hispanic. There are going to be deep conversations within the Latino, Latinx community about identity that doesn't have anything to do with anybody else's input. It's none of our business in a particular kind of way. It's their right to have this conversation, to work out how they wish to be identified, how broad the spectrum will be, what is representation. And we need to be allies and supportive in that discussion and not make it harder, but make it better. And then recognize, and how can we work better with intersectionality, is recognizing where we share spaces. I grew up in a diverse community of color, but principally of color, with very few white people. And so seeing telenovelas while getting my hair braided was not a shocking thing to me. And so, it's I can recognize what is the same thing in watching telenovelas to watching Black soap operas. And the importance of what it happens is when your grandmother or your granny or abuela is watching her stories and you need to be quiet. We are really not as dissimilar as people think. We have shared ideologies, and we need to stop acting like everything is so separate and that we know what certain groups are thinking. You don't know because you have not learned enough about that group. You can only identify with what you might share with that group. And one thing to what Dr. Zamora said, one of the things for community of color that we have to battle is survivor's remorse, survivor's guilt, and the act of being a survivor, the pride of being a survivor. I'm not saying these things are not important, but what I'm saying is it becomes a course of contention that does not allow you space to heal. It doesn't allow you space to tell your truth. It doesn't allow you space to be honest that you're hurting. And there's a lot of people of color who are hurting in this world right now. And they're suffering as majority Americans are suffering, because there's not a suffering Olympics. We're all suffering, but there's an addition to this. And suffering in silence is probably the worst thing that can happen to a human being.
I agree. And I actually, that was exactly where I wanted to talk about kind of next, to bring into the conversation, is this idea of building bridges that Dr. Salisbury brought up. Really, I think what intersectionality allows us to is to realize we're made up of more than just a single monolithic thing. Like, not only are our communities non-monolithic, but we ourselves are non-monolithic, right? And so, for example, actually, part of the conversation that is had in the Latinx community is about what exactly makes us Latinx, right? And that one aspect of a migratory experience and relation between Latin America and the United States is at times the only thing that brings us together, right, as Latinx. But that also can allow us to relate to other immigrant groups, right? Like the largest expanding immigrant group in the United States right now is Asian Americans, right? And so it's an experience that we'll share, even though the experiences will be different, right? And I cannot emphasize further the need for looking at these multi perspectives, right, as a way to create unity and support amongst these intersectional groups, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and going on with that too is that this being able to understand this, looking at it from multi perspectives and having a deeper understanding helps us to really also look at it. What is the problem, and what are the different areas that are contributing to this problem that we're facing? And from an intersectionality lens, we're able to address it and look at it from different perspectives, where we can look at what are the different factors that are contributing to this person and have a deeper understanding of the person's experience.
There's a great comment in the chat about being mixed race and not feeling worthy of one group or the other. And I think this is an important moment to kind of address that ideal. The point of intersectionality is not having to choose. You shouldn't have to choose. There is a richness of being Black and Filipino that made you. There's a richness to both of those things, and people need to see you with both of those lenses. And I feel your pain, because I know that the tragedy is that when you go to those different groups, they themselves make you choose. And that is not in your control. Part of that is about decades of pain, decades of anger, and decades of tribalism that resulted as a support system. And so you have to keep fighting, and you have to keep bringing people together. And a great example, I think, of where it worked was the current U.S. women's, number one tennis player in the world, Naomi Osaka, who is half Haitian and half Japanese, recently used her agency and her platform to bring to life Black Lives Matter by wearing face masks when she entered the court of the names of Black people who have been murdered by the police. She also chose to not participate in a match because she said she was a Black woman first, which was a very powerful statement because she is also quite clearly a very proud Japanese woman, a proud Haitian Japanese woman. Her agency resonated not only in America, but in Haiti and in Japan. And it forced people to come together to see her as a whole. The media continues to portray her as Japanese, despite whatever she says. So that's what we mean about power. It's the one individual power. It will be her fans. It will be the supporters of tennis. It will be Black people, it will be Haitian people, it will be Japanese people who will force the world to see Naomi Osaka as the whole person she is.
Yeah, there's a lot of theorization as we know, right? Like in Latin America, a lot of people are mixed and experience a mixed life where you might be perceived as one way or another, right? Might have more power or less power than somebody, right? But I think intersectionality really allows us to realize what are the power dynamics, right? Kind of like separating without separating, right? Recognizing the variety and the plurality within ourselves. Sylvia Rivera Cusicanqui, an Aymara mixed philosopher from Bolivia, really pushes mixed people in the Latin American context to identify with their indigenous selves. And she says it's not enough to just say, "Hey, I'm mixed." It's also important to recognize, okay, what are you doing to work through those power imbalances that exist within you as well, right? And I think Dr. Salisbury example was right on that note, right? There's actually a question on the Q&A that I also that is pretty straightforward, and I kind of also wanted to answer it. What identities fall under intersectionality? Are there limits to these categories? And I couldn't think of one. I think that's the point of intersectionality, right? Is to take in everything that happens to you, to make yourself and admit that, right?
And Rich, did you want to say something? Because I don't want to Bigfoot you. If you were,
no, go ahead, Gracie.
In addition to that question, what I'm going to say is, it's not that white people are not included in intersectionality. Is, in my view, there's work to do. For me to be worried about your intersectionality as a white person, I'm going to need you to address the long-term racism within your community, the long-term power, inequity of power. And right now, I have not seen, it's kind of a mixed bag of majority society of whether they're willing to address racism or not. We currently have a white supremacist in the Oval Office who does not recognize queer lives at all, does not recognize systemic racism, can't even say that there's a race problem in this country. So until majority folks, because this is your work, this isn't our work as people of color. Racism is your work right now, and I'm not seeing that responsibility. In addition to understanding intersectionality and the power of what you need to address is if you have anti-Blackness within your community, you need to address that. Okay, because see, the prejudice, there's prejudice that trickles down, and the prejudice is killing our nation because the prejudice is not just staying within one community, not blaming white Americans as just being racist, but the fact that that prejudice trickles down to communities of color. And this is why when you have mixed race children, okay, they are feeling funny about who they are because we have now ingested that prejudice, and we are enacting it on people. I don't know what a white Latino means anymore, because in Puerto Rico, people identify as white. But you know what? White people get treated better than Puerto Ricans are currently being treated. So I have a misunderstanding of what people think whiteness is. Okay? So we use whiteness because we feel it is a position of power. It is a position of acceptance. It's a position of normalcy. So until we get to a position in this country that we view everyone as an example of American life, regardless of how you got here, then we can't do better in terms of intersectionality. We can recognize intersectionality all we want to, but Dr. Crenshaw makes clear we must represent and we must fight. So if we're not fighting, we have a problem.
Mm-hmm.
Richard, did you want to add anything else?
I appreciate you talking about that, Dr. Salisbury. I think, part of looking at things from an intersectionality lens is also recognizing and being aware of your own role and understanding and looking at it from that lens. So I appreciate your bringing up the role of power and systems here, and what part of the system are you? And are you coming from a privileged background? We talk about oppression and privilege here. And when you look at it from an intersectionality lens, you also have to be aware of your own power and your role in the system, and being aware of your own privilege and what part of your role you can make the change and helping this community and folks who are part of marginalized communities, and what is it that your goal and your intention, and how can you utilize that power to make the change and to help and support and represent this community.
And understand that what you see first may not be how I identify. Is the fact that just because you see my brown skin, yes, people that know me well know I represent blickety black politics first. But there's a good friend of mine, my sister, my fellow colleague, that queer issues are her priority when she wakes up in the morning. And there's nothing wrong with that. That's something we need to understand about intersectionality too. My concern, if I'm a disabled person, it might be that. Can I get where I need to get today?
Right.
And intersectionality is just adding to the fact that racism and homophobia might add to my problems throughout the day. Okay. But my first priority may be as a disabled person or as a queer person. As I said to somebody today, I'm picking my girlfriend up at the train station in Bakersfield today. It will be a question first about how I greet her. Do I hug her? Do I kiss her? Or do I wait till we get to the car because someone might say something? That is a difference of privilege. Okay. That is a difference of power. That makes me upset, because this is someone I don't get to see on a regular basis.
Right. Yeah, and that power changes depending on where you are, right? For some more than others. I think one of the concepts that is really also important in highlighting what Dr. Salazar just talked about is the concept of passing, right? Within the Latino community, it's something that needs to be addressed more often than it is. But even when you are in a different place, like when you are moving through a different space, if you are in Latin America, what are you considered? If you are in Southern California, but what about when you're in New York, right? How does that power move? And also understand that not everybody has that ability to pass, right? Not everybody can pass.
And passing comes from stereotypes. I don't know if you're aware, but a professor recently lost her job because she had been passing. She was a white woman, a white Jewish woman, and had been passing in some kind of caricature of an Afro-Latina for many, many years. And I think what was not aggravating, because apparently she does good research work, good scholarly work, but what was so infuriating was it was a caricature of what she thought being an Afro-Latino was, down to a cartoon voice, down to an outfit. And race and gender is not something you put on like a coat and take off and put down on a hanger. And so it was just infuriating to know that had passed. And that told me a lot, that her colleagues didn't have a lot of interaction with actual Afro-Latinas, actual Latinos, actual Black people. And that they checked this box because this is what they thought. And that is the horrifying nature of that. That institution needs an examination. That's why we all across academia need a kind of a reflection of where we are at.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely. Since you brought up something that's happening recently, another movement, contemporary movement, right, is that of Black Lives Matter, and we had a question of how does Black Lives Matter and intersectionality converse, right? It's from my perspective, it's also bringing in that internalized racism that the Latino community has, right? That anti-Blackness that the Latino community tends to allow within itself. Thankfully, a lot of younger Latinx people are fighting against that, right? Are being supportive of the BLM movement, but it's still something that happens within the Latinx community, right? How do you guys see that?
Well, it's in some way symbolic to colorism within the Black community. It stems from historical perspectives of treatment and who gets treated better. And, part of why this young lady got away with what she got away with is there's light skin privilege. That's something we all have to grapple with. We have to become more in love with who we are, that, what we have and what we do is okay. I love these dreadlocks. I wish I'd started earlier. But there's discrimination. I can be fired in certain workplaces for wearing my natural hair. This is a challenge. As I said, there is two or three different discussions going on. There's a community discussion within these racialized groups. There's a outside world discussion, and then there's a human discussion. And it's tough to balance all of these things. Particularly when your community is moving, it doesn't always seem like progress, but there is quick progress being made in certain ways. And sometimes that progress is moving faster than the people and the discussions. And, when I look at the Asian community right now, I kind of feel Black and Latino folks are letting them down. They're facing a certain kind of racism right now. And because there's been some tradition of anti-Blackness and anti-Latino-ness, there's this, well, now it's just their turn. That's unacceptable. Because number one, it's violent. One of the things about this kind of discrimination, it's violent, it's dangerous. That's something the queer community understands quite well. Identifying can get you dead. And so we got to stop it. Somewhere in our work, we have got to communicate better. And so this kind of discrimination, we had a congressman get up and actually argue that he thought it was dividing the country that he's not able to say China virus. Even though it has a medical name, COVID-19, he was angry that he was not allowed to be openly racist. We can't do this. That's so simplistic and so dangerous. And so intersectionality is that reminder that you have been consistently told that saying China virus is resulting in direct violence against the Asian community, and human beings are not particularly good at bothering to identify who might be Chinese. So, this is why September 11th, we had Lebanese people, we had Palestinian people being attacked, because everybody that had an olive skin color and might wear a turban was attacked as being Muslim. We are too simplistic about race to make direct determinations about race. And so we have to start trying to get past these bridges and start talking to one another and have hard conversations. These conversations aren't easy. I get it. I get it. Particularly for majority folks. You don't want to be called a racist. You don't particularly if you have a lot of education, don't want to be exposed as not being knowledgeable. I get it. But you have to have the conversation. And you have to be a listener, which might be hard when you're used to being the talker and the decision maker.
Yeah, there's
looking at the queue and the questions here. Go ahead.
No. I was just going to say I like that. Like to highlight one point that Dr. Salisbury just made, which is that it starts with us, right? It's part of our community. It's a conversation that we have with our community, but it starts with us, right? And I know somebody was mentioning trauma in the conversation over here. I remember I read that word somewhere right now, but we have to look at that ourselves, right? we have to recognize our traumas and how those racialized experiences, right, the experiences informed by race have affected us, in order to be able to talk about them, in order to be able to actually stand up for ourselves, right, to bring up the conversation. Right? It's definitely not easy. Maybe you're having a conversation with, I don't know, a grandparent, a parent, an uncle, even a sister, brother, right, who's next to you, who doesn't believe that their experience is informed by race or by gender or by any of these intersectional perspectives, right? But it's a conversation that needs to be had, right?
There's a few questions in the Q&A. What can we do to raise our level of cultural competence as faculty and students? You guys want to tackle that?
I think, a big part of increasing cultural competency as faculty, administration, staff, students is one big aspect of that is educating yourself, increasing awareness, reading about the movements that are currently going on, the history of these movements, learning, reading from different sources of information. And I think it's really important to also consider where are you getting your sources and your information, who are writing these information that you're reading, and and what I mean by that also is what perspective are they utilizing to share the information and share the knowledge. And in increasing cultural competency, part of that is looking at it in different perspectives, reading, information from different folks who talk about these issues, and also thinking of ways and how you can transform that knowledge into action in the different spaces you're in. It could be in a classroom, it could be, in a work setting or in a staff meeting. Really trying to understand it and educate yourself as part of increasing your cultural competency.
And, go ahead, Arno. No, go ahead, Arno.
Okay, thank you. I think that the university has it's the job of the university to bring these topics up, to partake in the conversation, right? To allow students to be exposed to these topics. It's not just, hey, take this course, right? Or hey, we're going to talk about how this one movement of certain people affected this moment in history, right? No, it's a constant conversation. I know there has been there was a law that was just passed, right, in California to add an ethnic studies component to all degrees given by CSUs. I'm not sure if UCs also have it, but it's part that's the universities. That's part of the initiative that universities should have taken, right? That's a necessary conversation, and not to water it down, right? Not to say, hey, we only need to talk about how race impacts our field. No. Let's talk about race in itself, right? Let's talk about gender in itself, right? Let's talk about these things and give them their own space, right? And that's not just say, hey, this is how it impacts this field. We need to have a conversation that focuses on these intersectional perspectives. One that's in my field, right, is obviously the Latino perspective, the migratory perspective, but also how does speaking a different language mean that you are? How does that affect your point of view? Obviously, in the modern languages department, yes, we teach Spanish. There are classes in Japanese and Chinese and French, but how many of our students are being exposed to other languages, to other perspectives, right? We don't have a language requirement for a major for the university, and so I understand that for some it might be, hey, I just want to get a job, but how can you perform better in a job, in any type of job that you do? It's by educating yourself on who you're working with, on who you're relating. And honestly, in California, Spanish is the second most widely spoken language. After Spanish, it's Tagalog, right? And so these are parts of the conversation that need to be had within the university, and ways in which a university can support the cultural competence of our faculty and students.
And this is the moment where I get into trouble. CSUB is a non-activist campus, and we need to stop it. We are a campus that whines in quiet, complains in quiet, and we are a campus that needs to stand up and get involved. The field of ethnic studies, the academic field of academic studies, is older than this institution. And the fact we did not have ethnic studies on this campus is criminal. The fact that we did not have an introduction to Latino studies class on this campus until last year was criminal. The fact that the president brought a wonderful speaker University Day, Dr. Evans, thank you for reminding me, Dr. Sean Harper, he was talking about the racism on our campus. He had never visited our campus, but it felt like he had been here. And we failed to have even a remote conversation. And I'm calling out my colleagues directly on that. In fact, it was more important to tone police me, because I was rather frustrated that we had gone through our entire faculty senate meeting and it hadn't come up at all. I resent that deeply, but I also lost faith in the faculty that day because I'm tired of repeating the same stuff. If you don't want to talk about race, then we're a racist institution. If you don't want to talk about sexism, then we're a sexist institution. If you don't want to talk about homophobia, then we are a homophobic institution. We have to do better. This includes the students. If you want a Black student center, if you want a Latino student center, if you want an Asian student center, you want a queer student center, the grades have to improve. Retention has to improve. And you have to be an active and involved student in your community. You need to stop pretending it doesn't affect you. CSUB, the motto is rise, which means we must rise to the occasion and we must start standing up for the things we want to believe in. For the last 3 years, I have done nothing but think about quitting this profession. Because after 20 years, the disappointment has stayed steady. And what keeps me in the game is the students. And I have a wonderful young lady who needed to have someone to listen to her for about a half hour, who works full time at the Lone Detention Center, trying to close the Lone Immigrant Detention Center in Kern County. And it is wearing her out. It is emotionally and physically taxing to her while she's trying to earn her degree. We understand you students are busy. We understand that we are underserved faculty and we are busy. But there's just too bad. There's work to do. And we are wearing out the same group of people. This should not have been a panel of junior faculty. This should have been a panel of senior faculty. This is for all the intelligence that's on this campus, all the passion. We need to simply embrace that we are struggling, and our 50th anniversary, we are going to do better and be better for that next 50th. Okay? I am at wit's end on this. This is the last community conversation I'm doing. I've done 3. Somebody else needs to step up. I know some of y'all are afraid of me. You're tired of hearing me. I'm only going to get louder. I've made up my mind to get louder. I'm going to be around you more often. And I'm going to stir up the students more often and my colleagues. I'm tired. Black Lives Matter means simply this, because I know people have opinions about Black Lives Matter. But to me, Black Lives Matter simply means this. If it does not involve Black people, then it's not good for Black people. It's quite that simple. So it's more than educating yourself. You have to involve yourself. Once again, my quote, my passion, Audre Lorde in the back, your silence will not protect you.
I think that answers one of the questions that we have in the Q&A, right? About bringing up conversations about race and queerness, about any of these intersectional perspectives in class or wherever. Bring it up. I mean, that's what we need to talk about, right? Somebody might have their own agenda they don't know about, but if you feel like the conversation needs to have that being part of the conversation, do it. It's necessary for us to talk, but to do, right? And they work in concert.
Looking at the other questions here.
Yeah, we have only 1 minute left. So
there needs to be a part 2. Thank you, Arnold, Richard. This was really awesome. Claudia, thank you for arranging it, and Jorge and Maria for arranging this for us and making it a welcome space.
Thank you, ASI.
Yes, thank you, ASI, and acknowledging people to be heard. This has been a thing, and the president and the provost, thank you. Feeling free to say what I wish to say. I do not feel oppressed in that sense.
Yes, thank you for all of this and the space. And I do agree that the conversation needs to continue and that there's a lot of work to do.
Rich, I want to say one thing. Quentin, if you want to contact me personally, I'll be happy to have a conversation with you about our president's white supremacy problem.
Yeah, I just wanted to thank everybody as well, everybody who tuned in, and thank you to everybody who organized it. It's wonderful to see everybody participating and really acknowledging the need for this.
Our sincere gratitude to Drs. Argueta, Salisbury, and Zamora for this powerful conversation on intersectionality and how power moves in our society and in our university. And I do agree that we need a part 2 in various conversations to continue this momentum. And in reading comments from our audience, I know it has given our campus community a lot to reflect on. Our next community conversation is scheduled for mid-October, and we will send a campus notification once the date is finalized. I also want to acknowledge that there has been an expressed interest from our students in learning more about racial inequities and mass incarceration. And I want to bring light to 2 events that are currently being planned. The Kegley Institute of Ethics, led by Dr. Michael Burrows, has 2 events scheduled on this topic. November 12th at 6 p.m., they are hosting Miriam Powell, whose talk will be on rethinking crime, punishment, and redemption in California, the legacy of the Governors Brown, and will focus on the history of incarceration in California. The second event is on November 18th at 6 p.m., and they will host a second event titled Humanities Beyond Bars Panel, Reimagining Public Safety, which will be a contemporary conversation on policing, incarceration, and the prison industrial complex. These events are both free and open to the public. Thank you again for joining us and have a wonderful Thursday.